Tonight, we embark on a journey through time retracing the intricate dance India performed to maintain its independence and neutrality amid the heated rivalries of the Cold War. Imagine walking through the streets of New Delhi in the late 1940s, feeling the fresh optimism of a newly independent nation trying to make its mark. The air is thick with possibility, but the weight of global tensions looms large. You probably won't survive this ride without a few moments of reflection on just how remarkable it was for India to carve out a distinct path amidst the world's superpower struggles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Let's make this journey a bit more personal. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. After India gained independence in 1947, it faced a monumental challenge. While newly freed from the shackles of colonial rule, it found itself amidst the sharpest global divide in modern history, the Cold War. On one side you had the capitalist democracy-promoting United States, and on the other, the communist centrally planned Soviet Union. Both sought to pull the newly minted nations of the world into their respective orbits. But India, under its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had a different idea to navigate a path of non-alignment steering clear of these superpower quarrels. The country's leaders understood that India, with its long history of colonization, needed to avoid being shackled by any other foreign power. The global community thought India could either lean west or east, but Nehru made it clear India would follow neither. Historians still argue whether India's strategy of non-alignment was a viable long-term strategy, especially as both superpowers intensified their attempts to influence the emerging world order. But for India, the immediate goal was not to be a pawn in someone else's game. It sought its own position in a world that seemed divided down the middle. Amid all this chaos, India chose the route of neutrality, a stance that would define its foreign policy for decades to come. As the world plunged deeper into the Cold War, Nehru's India felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. The nation, just a few years into independence, had to figure out how to handle the massive global tug-of-war between the US and the Soviet Union. Nehru, with his vision of a newly independent India, saw a crucial opportunity to navigate the murky waters of global politics while keeping the country free from the influence of either superpower. At the heart of his thinking was a simple idea. India, with its complex, diverse society and its history of colonial subjugation, must define its own path. His foreign policy was based on the belief that countries should have the freedom to develop according to their own needs, not be forced into foreign ideological camps. Remember that time Nehru went all in for neutrality during the Korean War in the early 1950s. His stand wasn't just a political statement, it was a revolutionary way of looking at global power structures. Nehru didn't simply want India to survive the Cold War, he wanted it to thrive independently, charting its own course in a world increasingly fragmented by ideological extremes. His government, to the surprise of many, refused to side with either the US or the USSR. Instead, India threw its weight behind the newly formed United Nations and called for peaceful coexistence among all nations. Historians still argue whether India's policy of non-alignment was an idealistic dream or a pragmatic necessity. Some claim it was a strategic move to avoid picking sides at a time when India's political stability was still fragile. But there is little doubt that Nehru's commitment to this principle shaped not just India's foreign policy, but the attitudes of many other newly independent nations as well. His vision gave rise to a global movement that would later be formalized in the non-aligned movement NAM. For Nehru, the challenge wasn't just balancing the world's superpowers, it was ensuring that India's voice as a leader of the global South would always be heard. The year 1955 would become a significant milestone in India's non-alignment journey. Enter the Bandung Conference, a gathering of newly independent nations from Asia and Africa, convened in Indonesia. For India, this was not just another international meeting, it was a chance to solidify its position as a leader of the non-aligned movement and create a collective voice for nations that didn't want to be subjugated by the pressures of Cold War politics. Nehru, ever the diplomat, was among the key figures pushing for the creation of a new bloc that wasn't bound by alliances with either of the world's superpowers. This wasn't merely a political statement, it was India's call for a future where countries, regardless of their size or military, could stand tall and assert their independence. Now imagine the scene: representatives from 29 countries, some just emerging from the clutches of colonial rule, gathered in the warm, humid air of Bandung. Nehru stood among them, advocating for peace and cooperation, laying the groundwork for a policy that would reverberate through international relations for decades to come. But the conference wasn't just about lofty ideals, it was about practical concerns. How would these nations handle the threat of being caught in the middle of the Cold War's icy standoff? How would they ensure their sovereignty without being swallowed by the superpower rivalry? Historians still argue whether the Bandung Conference was the true beginning of the non-aligned movement or merely a symbolic gesture. Some suggest that the movement didn't really solidify until the 1960s, when the global political landscape began to crystallize around the two superpowers. Yet for many, Bandung represented the first formal call for a third way, one where the global South could find solidarity, not in competing with the superpowers, but in charting its own course. India's role in this under Nehru's leadership was pivotal. His belief in the moral authority of newly independent nations shaped the discourse of global diplomacy and shifted the narrative away from Cold War binaries. As the Cold War raged on, India found itself in an increasingly precarious position. Its foreign policy, rooted in the ideals of non-alignment, was about to face one of its first true tests in the early 1960s. The relationship between India and China, once rooted in mutual admiration, began to sour, culminating in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. This conflict would not only test India's ability to navigate a complex regional landscape, but also put the country's non-aligned stance under intense scrutiny. The world watched as India, under Nehru's leadership, tried to maintain a delicate balance between neutrality and self-defense, and yet the pressure to align with either the US or the USSR became undeniable. Let's take a moment to imagine the tension of that time: India, an emerging power in the global South, facing off with China, a nation that had itself broken free from imperialism, but now represented a different ideological force. The war, though brief, was bitter and humiliating for India. The defeat left a deep scar on the Indian psyche, and Nehru's inability to prevent the loss of territory raised questions about the future of India's diplomatic and military strategies. How could India remain neutral in a world that seemed to demand alignment for survival? Historians still argue whether the Sino-Indian War signified the failure of India's non-alignment policy, or whether it merely highlighted the limitations of a policy that could not account for all of the complexities of Cold War geopolitics. While India did not formally align with either superpower during the conflict, the war opened the door for stronger defense ties with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, seeing an opportunity to expand its influence in Asia, offered military and diplomatic support to India, which it gratefully accepted. The Sino-Indian War therefore marked a shift in India's approach, but it also solidified the notion that non-alignment was a flexible concept, one that could bend but not break in times of crisis. While India was grappling with the aftermath of its border conflict with China, another geopolitical challenge loomed on the horizon: Pakistan's growing alliances with the United States. By the early 1950s, Pakistan, seeking to strengthen its defense and gain economic support, had entered into military pacts with the US, notably the Baghdad Pact and later SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. This was seen as a direct counterbalance to India's independent stance, and the increasing military cooperation between Pakistan and the US put India on alert. Pakistan's alliance with the United States meant that India was left to confront a formidable neighbor with increasing military might, while still adhering to its principle of non-alignment. In those years, India faced the tough task of managing a difficult relationship with a neighbor that not only had a close relationship with the US, but also shared deep historical grievances with India. It was an ironic twist for India's foreign policy. How could the world's largest democracy and advocate for peace and cooperation balance its national security concerns while avoiding the sway of Cold War alliances? Nehru's approach, though grounded in idealism, began to face its limits as Pakistan's alliance with the US deepened. While Nehru refrained from directly confronting the US or joining in anti-American rhetoric, the growing closeness between Washington and Islamabad forced India to seek its own strategic alignments. Historians still debate whether India's non-alignment strategy was effective in the face of Pakistan's alliances with the US. Some argue that India could have benefited from aligning with one of the superpowers to strengthen its own defense capabilities. Others suggest that India's strategy of non-alignment, coupled with its relationships with countries like the Soviet Union and its growing military capacity, allowed it to maintain its sovereignty while still managing regional tensions. The challenge of Pakistan's military alignment with the US forced India to adapt, but it also reinforced India's conviction that it would not be drawn into the Cold War's ideological struggles. As the Cold War unfolded, the global stage was increasingly defined by nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had amassed terrifying arsenals, and the world teetered on the brink of nuclear annihilation. India, however, remained steadfast in its commitment to non-alignment, but the question of nuclear weapons loomed large. Would India join the nuclear arms race, or would it resist the temptation to develop its own nuclear capabilities? The Indian government under Nehru's leadership and later under his successors faced an ongoing dilemma. On one hand, the prospect of acquiring nuclear weapons seemed to offer a means of strengthening national security. On the other hand, it would inevitably draw India into the Cold War rivalry, breaking the very foundation of its non-aligned stance. In 1974, India conducted its first successful nuclear test, code-named Smiling Buddha, in the desert of Rajasthan. The test sent shockwaves through the international community, signaling that India was no longer willing to stand on the sidelines of the global nuclear race. This was a moment that would change the trajectory of India's foreign policy forever. The test was an assertion of India's right to self-defense and a defiance of global nuclear non-proliferation norms, but it also raised questions about whether India had truly maintained its non-aligned status. While India insisted that its nuclear program was for peaceful purposes, the test had all the hallmarks of a nation preparing for a more aggressive stance in international relations. Historians still argue whether India's decision to go nuclear was a necessary step for national security, or whether it marked the beginning of India's departure from its non-alignment policy. Some believe that the test was an essential response to growing threats from China and Pakistan. Others contend that it was a reaction to the changing dynamics of the Cold War, particularly as the US and Soviet Union began to recalibrate their approaches to global diplomacy. Either way, the test marked a watershed moment in India's foreign policy, and it was clear that non-alignment was evolving in response to the challenges of a rapidly changing world. By the time Indira Gandhi took the reins of leadership in 1966, the world and India's place in it had shifted dramatically. Nehru's vision of non-alignment, which had been tested by the Sino-Indian War and growing Cold War pressures, continued to influence India's foreign policy, but under Gandhi's leadership, India's approach became more assertive. Gandhi, who was not afraid to take bold steps in matters of national security, notably led India through the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, which would become one of her most defining moments as a leader. The conflict marked a dramatic shift not only for India, but for the region. In response to Pakistan's brutal crackdown on Bengali nationalists, India intervened, helping to secure the independence of Bangladesh. The war's outcome was a testament to India's military capability, but it also raised questions about India's evolving foreign policy, especially given its long-standing policy of non-alignment. Now imagine the weight of that decision: a leader in the midst of Cold War rivalries choosing to engage directly in a regional conflict that would have significant global implications. India's victory in the war and the creation of Bangladesh reshaped the balance of power in South Asia. Gandhi's actions reflected a more pragmatic and less idealistic approach to foreign policy. While the non-aligned movement remained a pillar of India's strategy, The reality was that India could no longer afford to remain neutral in situations where its national interests were directly threatened. Historians still debate whether the Bangladesh Liberation War marked the end of India's non-alignment policy, or if it was a continuation of a strategic neutrality that allowed for regional intervention when necessary. Some argue that the war was a shift toward a more interventionist policy, while others suggest it was a natural evolution of non-alignment in response to geopolitical realities. Regardless, the success of India's military intervention in 1971 demonstrated that India could act decisively on its own terms, and the world began to take notice. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era in global politics. For decades, the Cold War had defined the geopolitical landscape, and India had positioned itself as a key player within the non-aligned movement, navigating the delicate balancing act between two superpowers. But with the dissolution of the USSR, India found itself confronting an entirely new world order. The bipolar world of the Cold War was replaced by a more complex unipolar system dominated by the United States. This shift forced India to rethink its approach to global relations and non-alignment, once a guiding principle began to seem increasingly outdated in a world where the US was the undisputed global leader. India, however, did not abandon its non-alignment legacy. Instead, it sought to adapt its foreign policy to the changing dynamics of the post-Cold War world. One of the first moves India made was to seek closer economic ties with the United States. The 1990s saw India begin its economic liberalization, moving away from its protectionist socialist policies and opening up to global markets. This was a profound shift for a country that had long resisted foreign economic influence. The reforms led by then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh were critical for India's economic growth and global integration. Yet even as India embraced globalization, it remained committed to its independence in foreign policy, refusing to align with any single superpower. Historians still debate whether India's new relationship with the United States marked the end of non-alignment or its transformation. Some argue that India's move toward closer ties with the US was a natural evolution of its foreign policy in a unipolar world, while others suggest that India was simply diversifying its partnerships as it had done throughout its history. What is clear, however, is that India had shifted away from the strict neutrality of the Cold War era without fully embracing the Cold War era superpower dynamics. As the 21st century progressed, India's foreign policy began to show yet another evolution. The country, once the leader of the non-aligned movement, found itself navigating a new global order, where traditional alliances were no longer as clear-cut. The rise of China as a global economic and military power posed a direct challenge to India, particularly in Asia. Meanwhile, the United States, though a strategic partner in some areas, was increasingly focused on its own global priorities. For India, this complex geopolitical landscape required a careful balancing act, one where it could assert its influence without being beholden to any one power. In the 2000s, India began to deepen its strategic ties with the US, particularly through the India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2005, which allowed India to access nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. This was a significant shift from the Cold War era, when India had refused to align itself with any nuclear power. The agreement symbolized India's gradual acceptance of the idea that non-alignment no longer needed to equate to isolation or avoidance of strategic partnerships. Yet even as it grew closer to the US, India maintained its independence by pursuing relationships with other global powers, including Russia, Japan, and the European Union. The rise of regional organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO) and the BRICS grouping has also played a key role in shaping India's modern foreign policy. India's participation in these organizations illustrates how its non-alignment policy has transformed into a more multilateral approach, one that allows India to engage with multiple global powers while still asserting its sovereignty and independence. The 21st century has seen India position itself as a global player, balancing its economic aspirations with its strategic interests, all while maintaining the essence of its non-alignment legacy. Historians still argue whether India's engagement with global powers, particularly the US, signals the death of non-alignment, or whether it marks a new chapter in a policy that is more flexible and pragmatic than ever before. While India no longer adheres to the strict neutrality of the past, its ability to navigate complex international waters without fully surrendering to any one power speaks to the resilience of non-alignment in the modern world. As we reach the present day, India stands at the crossroads of a rapidly changing global landscape. Non-alignment, as it was originally conceived, may no longer be as central to India's foreign policy as it once was. The world has changed, the Cold War is long over, and new alliances and rivalries are emerging at an unprecedented pace. Yet the principles that guided India through decades of global tension still resonate in its current approach to international relations. The strategic autonomy that India sought to maintain throughout the 20th century has evolved into a more nuanced, dynamic foreign policy in the 21st century. Non-alignment may not be the bedrock of India's international strategy anymore, but the idea of maintaining independence, avoiding being unduly influenced by any single power, remains deeply embedded in India's diplomatic DNA. Today, India navigates its foreign policy with a sense of cautious pragmatism, seeking to strengthen ties with the West, particularly the United States, while deepening its engagement with regional players such as Russia and China. India's strategic interests are increasingly defined by economic partnerships, regional security concerns, and global governance issues, from climate change to trade. In this new world order, India's role as a balancing power has become more pronounced. Its growing influence in organizations like the United Nations, the G20, and the Quad reflects a shift towards active global engagement rather than passive neutrality. Historians still debate whether India's current approach constitutes a form of non-alignment 2.0, or if it has simply embraced a new era of strategic hedging, one where it aligns with multiple global powers while still maintaining its autonomy. The truth is likely somewhere in between. India, in 2025 and beyond, is no longer just the champion of the non-aligned movement. It is an emerging global power in its own right, wielding its influence with care and precision. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of non-alignment, not that it was about avoiding alliances, but that it was about ensuring that India could always make its own choices on its own terms, regardless of global pressure.